My name is Colin Duriez. Well, it all started when I was in grammar school. We in one of the classes we were reading around C.S. Lewis's book Mere Christianity. I'd never heard of C.S. Lewis, and I was gripped by his style. I wanted to read all his books, and it was through him that I came across the name Tolkien, and that interested me because I've got a French surname, and I thought, he's somebody with a Germanic surname. That's interesting. And then, of course, The Hobbit appeared, and I read that, and then I went off to Istanbul for 2 years, the University of Istanbul, and it's there that I read the Lord of the Rings, borrowed the books from the British Council Library, and that's where it all started. And I started writing articles, an article on Tolkien, and which I called Leonardo, Tolkien, and Mr. Baggins, and I'd given it as a talk. And I did as kind of an essay as part of my course at the university, and then it was sent. I met somebody who was from an American university, and he was just there for a year, a transfer over the two, and he sent it off. He said, "Could I send it off to Clyde Kilby in Wheaton College, who had met Tolkien, had spent a summer with him actually, to help him when he was working on the Silmarillion and that." And Clyde Kilby asked if he could send it on to California because there was lots of interest in Tolkien there. You know, it was a kind of hippie era, and it appeared in a fanzine basically about Tolkien, which was a very interesting one, and that was my first big article on Tolkien, and that's where it all started. And then since then I've written quite a few books on Tolkien and his friend C.S. Lewis, and I've also veered towards Harry Potter and others. But I just very much like fantasy writing, and that was something that drew me in. And one of the earliest books I wrote was on the friendship between Tolkien and Lewis, which interested me greatly. And Tolkien, after the First World War, he came back to Oxford, and he worked for a while on the big English dictionary. I think it was called the English Dictionary. I can't remember the exact name that it had, but he was given to work on the W section of it, and which I think he enjoyed very much, and was very much akin to his knowledge of philology and the history of words. It was very much his delight to do that. And after that, he got a job as a professor at Leeds University, where he very much enjoyed teaching the students. And after a while, he then got a professorship in Anglo-Saxon here in Oxford to Pembroke College. And it was a year after that he met C.S. Lewis, who had not long after Tolkien had started as a don at Magdalen College, teaching English, and he also taught some philosophy and other subjects, but English was his great love, especially going back to the medieval literature, and he also was very knowledgeable through his study on classics, and he was very wide-read, and but they met at an English tea, as it was called, here in Merton College, to talk about teaching English at the university, presumably, and so that's where Lewis started chatting with Tolkien, and afterwards he quite liked him, but he thought he was okay, but he needed a kind of a slap or so, and then he would be all right.
Yes, it had an interesting way of interacting with each other, didn't they?
That's
yes.
right.
So
yeah.
How did the Inklings come about? What was the origin of that group?
Well, it grew over a period. It eventually started off from friends that knew each other. Some of them were friends that Lewis had made as an undergraduate. And there came a point when there was a group of students that started a group called the Inklings. One of them was the brother of a famous filmmaker. But anyway, they were and it was a very mixed group of people. They weren't all just Oxford dons or professors and so on. They were a mix, and they weren't all teaching the same subject. They weren't all, say, teaching English literature, but various subjects. And for example, one of the early members of the group was C.S. Lewis's GP, which is Dr. Humphrey Havard. Well, the Humphrey was a nickname from one of the other Inklings, which happened a lot. They liked to play around with words all the time. That was part of it. They loved talking. And another idea behind it was a lot of them were writing, starting to write. I mean, Owen Barfoot, for example, had written a number of things, very important books. And also there was a lot of conversation about what people were writing. They would give feedback to it, rather like a writers' club that we have in this country and other places, which are very helpful. I know when I lived in Leicester, I went to an excellent writers' club, and I learned a lot from it because I was writing in a variety of kind of books, and I would get feedback, and I can understand why the Inklings was so attractive to young scholars, or people that were entering into the academic world or into a teaching world or whatever, and would gain a lot from it. So it wasn't until about 1933 that the Inklings were given that name. Well, actually, the name was never printed anywhere, but that seems to be when the name started anyway. So it grew out of friendship, and Lewis was very, and it was very much around C.S. Lewis. There's a rather amusing letter that Charles Williams, during the wartime, when he had to come to Oxford, as an evacuee in a sense, working for Oxford University Press, and he would write quite a lot of letters to Dorothy L. Sayers, who was a friend of hers. And Lewis said that she knew nothing about the Inklings, but in one of the letters, Williams talked about the group being like a court of the king, and the king, of course, was C.S. Lewis, and it was quite amusing to have the Inklings described in that way. And there's lots of different ways that you can describe them, but the fact is that they were real human beings. They were interacting as friends, and there was one or two bumps in it. For example, Hugo Dyson, who was one of the important members of the group, he rather disliked The Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien was reading many chapters from the Lord of the Rings as was being written, and Dyson didn't like it at all, and he had a veto to stop people just talking about elves and fairies and things like that, and it was quite funny. Well, on one occasion, Dyson was late arriving, which was something that happened quite a lot, and they got down to listening to Tolkien reading another chapter, and a very important section where everybody was following it, and Dyson burst into Lewis's rooms, and immediately the veto came into they stopped listening to Tolkien. Had to stop. and then they got on with. So they were a very, they were a very interesting group of people, and there came a time when they stopped reading and they continued discussion groups in pubs. So it became more of a conversational group after that. Although there was lots of conversation at the time when the reading was done by various people as well, centered around what had been read, and the conversational side of the group is just as important as the reading, in my view anyway, having researched as much as I could.
So what do you think the Inklings meant to Tolkien? Do you think he would have written his works without it?
I think they were very important to him. I think to have a listenership to what he was writing, because he knew he was going into ground that was, he knew that in the medieval period people would have fantasy and supernatural beings and so on, but it was a very different world that he was in, and to have a group of people that listened to him and responded to it, and at the time when his book came out, his friend C.S. Lewis wrote some blurb about it, and Tolkien actually was a bit worried in case, no, I think Lewis was a bit worried because he thought that maybe some people who didn't like him, it might have a bad effect on the Tolkien's book. But
So, if there was one thing by Tolkien that everyone should read, what do you think? Where would you start?
what age are you referring to?
An adult.
Adults. I think they should start reading The Hobbit.
It's quite a good. I say it was a bit contentious, is it? Do you start with Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit? Because The Hobbit, being a children's book, can put people off.
Yeah, it is. That's the first book of Tolkien I read as soon as I got hooked via Lewis. I saw The Hobbit in the W.H. Smiths and bought it. And when I was travelling to Istanbul, I was reading it on the journey, and I just fell in love with it. And then I found that the Lord, it led to the Lord of the Rings, and that was the next step. So in terms of starting, it's a difficult question, but the fact is that the films by Peter Jackson have encouraged many people to read. I think the sales of the Lord of the Rings have gone up quite a bit since those films came out. I mean, some people didn't like the films. You know, I remember when I was walking through a street in Leicester. I belonged to a small Tolkien group then, and one of the people there, he was almost in tears. He'd just seen the film, and he said, "Wasn't it so horrible?" And I said, "Well, I really liked it. I thought, you know, film's a very different a medium to writing books." And I said that Peter Jackson had done a very good job, and so probably that would be a good place for people to start, Lord of the Rings.